In this video, I'm going to produce some segmented wood eggs with their tornado pattern design. The tornado pattern will run all the way from the top to the very bottom of the egg. Due to the numerous steps in this project, I split this video production into 3 separate videos, each video being 15 to 25 minutes long. This is part 1 of the series, which describes the design of the segmented wood eggs, producing the segmented wedges, gluing up of the segmented disc, and slicing the thin layers of the segmented disc. Part 2 of this series will describe the gluing up the segmented disc layers to produce their tornado pattern segmented disc. Part 3 of this video presentation will describe the final glue up of the segmented disc layers, turning the egg on a lathe, and the final finishing of the segmented egg. A listing of all the products and supplies used in this project are listed at the end of this video. I begin by using the Woodturner Pro software to design a few segmented eggs with a tornado pattern. The first egg will use 2 alternating woods. The second egg will use 3 alternating woods. The eggs will each be 6 inches high and consist of 60 layers with 18 segments per layer. Each of the layers will be 0.1 inch thick. The tornado pattern will extend all the way from the top to the bottom of the eggs. This is possible because we can now cut accurate segments to produce a segmented ring with no center hole or opening. The center 40 to 50 segmented rings of the egg will be hollow with an inside diameter of 2 inches. I will demonstrate the reason for this later. From the Woodturner Pro software, I determined that my wood boards to make the rings will be 1.77 inches wide. My wedges will be 0.97 inches on the long side, and this will produce a segmented ring of 18 segments with an OD of 5.5 and an ID of 2 inches. I could make the rings with various OD sizes to minimize some wood waste, but the middle layers would all have to be 2.0 inches ID on all the center rings, so it's just easier to make them all the same size. For the top and bottom layers, I use the same 1.77 inch boards, but my segment edge length would be 0.62 for these layers. This will produce segments with no center opening. I begin by first selecting all my boards that I'm going to use for the project, and then I cut them on the bandsaw to 1.8 inches square. Afterwards, I run them through the planer and sand them all the way down to my 1.77 inches square. I set up my Accu-Wedge. I adjusted my fences to 18 segments because I want 18 segments for each of my rings. I mount my board. I'm going to do my first cut to just square off the board. I know I need my segments to be 0.97. After all the wedges have been cut on the bandsaw, they require a light sanding to remove the fuzzies off the edges. This usually just requires using some 220 grit sandpaper to lightly pass over the edges to get rid of the fuzzies and the small burr that's left by the bandsaw. Now I'm ready to start gluing up some of these rings that I made on the Accu-Wedge system. And I'm using this thicker epoxy from Marine. And I think I'll make up around 30 mils. So, or maybe I'll make 40 mils, 20 mils of each. So that's 20 mils of the hardener. And since the hardener is thicker and harder to pour, I pulled a thinner epoxy into the hardener. Be sure to thoroughly transfer all the epoxy resin to the second beaker. Then thoroughly mix the epoxy to assure that you get a uniform mix of the epoxy resins. I'm using an acid brush to apply a thin coat of the epoxy resin to both sides of each wedge. Then set each glued up wedge on a piece of wax paper, alternating each wedge between the two contrasting woods. Continue to add the wedges until the disc is complete. Clamp the wedges using rubber bands. Use as many rubber bands as necessary to form the wedges into a round segmented disc. Make sure the wedges meet in the center. This will produce a perfectly round segmented disc. Since we're using epoxy, the rubber bands are not reusable. They will later be cut off. In a likewise manner, glue up the larger segmented disc. Here I'm using a jig I made several years ago to glue up the larger disc. The jig consists of a 3/4 inch sheet of MDF with a series of holes for dowels. Rubber bands are then stretched onto these dowels on the board. After the wedges have been all assembled into the final size, rubber bands are slid onto the segmented disc to clamp them in place. After these segmented rings have been glued up with the epoxy, I usually try and take the rubber bands off within like 4 hours. If you wait much longer than that, it's really hard to get rubber bands off. They glue to the segmented disc pretty good. And you end up with a lot of residue on the surface, such as you see on these two. And that's glued on there pretty strong. And rather than try and scrape it off with a knife, I find the wire wheel is actually the easiest way to take it off. And that cleans it up pretty well. Okay, next I want to sand the faces, clean off the epoxy and get a smooth surface to see what I have. And I like using my edge sander or belt sander for doing this, much better than the disc sander. So after gluing all the pieces up and then sanding the surfaces flat, this is the resulting collection of segmented disc, and this will be enough disc to make at least 3, if not more, segmented eggs. We're ready to start slicing and gluing up our slivers of these discs to make our tornado pattern. So these discs all have an ID of 2 inches, and I produced this form with an OD of 2 inches. So this slides right over that, and as I cut these wedges, I can stack them up on here and glue them up so it'll be aligned on this center position. So now we're ready to take these over to the bandsaw and start slicing our disc. Okay, I installed my Accu-Slice table with my 12-inch carriage with sacrificial fence. I also changed my bandsaw blade. I'm using a 3/4 inch wide blade again, 10 teeth per inch. I've been using a 1/2 inch blades in the past, but I thought I'd try a 3/4 inch blade this time. I've attached double-sided tape to my disc, and actually I'm going to cut 2 discs at the same time. So I'll go ahead and mount this one disc. And then just clamp it lightly, set it in place. And then I'll attach my second disc. You notice there's 2 pieces of tape on this. Set my index knob to 0. Move my disc in so they just touch the blade. And then I'll advance the blade, the kerf for the blade, which is 50 thousandths, and another 50 thousandths. And then lock it in place. I moved the hammer to the other side so you can see a little bit better what I'm doing. So I sliced off 50 thousandths of each of these discs just to square off that surface. Now I'm going to make each of these slices 100 thousandths of an inch thick. So 100 thousandths will be 1 turn for the kerf of the blade, and then 2 full turns, 50 thousandths, and then another 50 thousandths. And I'll keep repeating that until all the discs are cut. Also notice on these discs I marked a line on each of these discs. That way I know where the same point is, so when I get these discs cut off I can align them much better. So now we're ready to start cutting. There I cut 20 discs. So I'll do another 20 with another set. I next cut the remaining solid segmented disc with no center hole on the Accu-Slice system, cutting 2 discs at the same time, and each disc layer will be again 100 thousandths of an inch thick. Each of my discs measures 95 thousandths all the way around, nice and straight. And I hate to get rid of the fuzzies, and so I give a light sanding on the surface, and they get rid of the fuzzies on the edge. And then I get my mark, my alignment mark. And the reason I like using these alignment marks, because even though the discs are symmetrical, there may be a little bit of variation from one side to the other. So by keeping these stacked up in the same orientation as I go around, I'm always certain that the disc, every second disc is right above the other one. And I'll be staggering those half segments. The smaller discs with no center hole are sanded in the same way, sanding both surfaces and then the edge to get rid of all the fuzzies. This is the end of part 1 of this video series. Part 2 will describe using epoxy to glue the segmented layers.